Howdy. Howdy. Thank you guys for being here today. Obviously, we are very fortunate here at the Bush School to have a number of practitioners who help guide you along. If you have not had the opportunity to visit with Professor Natsios, I would encourage you to do so. I'm not going to give him a long introduction, but obviously he has a very strong background in international development, former head of USAID, former head of World Vision, and a number of other places. So I'll turn it over to him, and he's going to share with you guys about opportunities in the international development field.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm Andrew Natsios, and I am doing this for efficiency's sake, since several of you have been to see me already, and you're going to start because this happened last year when I came. Everybody wants to have a visual job counseling session. So I'm doing this first. If you come to see me, you're happy to do it. I will talk to any Bush School student. Do not invite friends, please, because at Georgetown, I had students from other universities coming, and after a year of this, I said no more, only Georgetown students. Right now, it's only Bush School students that I will see, okay? And you're going to hear the same thing if you come to see me. You can then ask individual questions that you forget to ask now, okay? So you still can come, but this is the basic lecture. Now, I also didn't do this last year to prepare slides, actually. I should have, because you don't have to take notes. If you wish, we will. Should we send out a piece of paper? They can put their email address. Okay. Put your name and your Bush School email address, and if you wish this as just to get it for reference sake, you can do that. Or not. Okay, first, let me just say this to all of you who are thinking of going into international development. If you wish to save the world, you like singing Kumbaya, you like hugging people, do me a favor, do the international development world a favor. Don't go into international development. Do something else, please. Save us all in international from the pain of having to inform you that you are not going to save the world. Okay? You can serve, you can make marginal improvements in the world, you can help other people improve their lives, but you are not going to save the world. And if you're a crusader, you'll actually probably end up doing damage. The dumbest people I've met, even though they're very smart academically, in this kind of work, are people who think they're in a crusade to save the world. This is a profession, like the military is a profession, like diplomacy is a profession. This is not what it was 50 years ago, where a few volunteers wanted. Some of you may have done some missions work in your church, and that's fine. That's charitable work. And there's nothing wrong with charitable, but it's not development work. Not the same thing. Okay? So I'm going to go through this and talk through what the job options are, how big the field is now, how many people work in these disciplines, and how professionalized it has become. Some people think that's not good. I actually think it's very good, because it means we don't have to make the same mistakes over and over again by volunteers who think they're doing good things when in fact they're maybe doing damage. Not working? So we prepared these for nothing? Okay. There are two job tracks in development for international work. Okay? One is the emergency track. For those of you taking my course, Famines, War, and Humanitarian Assistance, that's the emergency response field. And I just want to show you in terms of spending, this is, I believe, in billions here. In terms of time, the last data we have is from 2007. The orange, or the terracotta color, is long-term development assistance. Okay? The green is short-term humanitarian assistance in emergencies. What does that mean? It means famines, war, natural disasters like earthquake response, the Haiti earthquake, for example, the tsunami that took place in the Indian Ocean was in end of December of 2004. There are about 60 emergencies a year, disasters a year. Natural disasters, war, humanitarian assistance. The United States government the last 2 years spent, most of it spent by AID and the Refugee Program Office and the State Department, spent $1 billion in Syria alone, and refugees from Syria who were in neighboring countries. Okay, so it's a lot of money. You can see here it's a couple of $1 billion. I believe this chart is for. Doesn't say, this is not my chart. A friend of mine who tested this. I'm fairly certain this data is for the U.S. It's for the U.S. government alone. It does not include data from other European democracies or Canada or Australia. You also have aid programs. The next one, please. Peter Walker, who's actually a famous, well-known scholar and friend of mine in famine research and famine theory, did these slides, and he did some research at the Feinstein Family Center at Tufts. And I actually never seen this data before until he showed this slide at a conference I was speaking at last year. It's not precise, but it's the most accurate data we've had. This is all workers. Again, 384,000. These are not volunteers. These are professional jobs in development. 384,000. And that's broadly speaking. And then you have people who work in NGOs, 112,000. The UN, 49,000. And RC, I think is. I see what it is. This is the relief area, and this is a long-term development area. Okay, so these three chunks here. So that would be about 210,000 people do humanitarian work in emergencies. So those are the two career tracks. What's the difference between them? Well, in humanitarian assistance, you'll be going to, most of this is spent in war zones. There is some emergency money spent in an earthquake and all that, like Haiti. But most of this is war zones and famines. And it's fast moving, it's dangerous work, there's a lot of insecurity, and you have to move rapidly. You have to have skills managing crises. If you hear gunfire and you get scared to death, and we used to actually have people, I'd send them out to the field in the middle of a war, and they hit one gunshot, and they have a nervous breakdown. We actually asked people when we hired after this was during the Liberian Civil War. Our staff was on the floor sleeping at night because there were bullets coming into the windows. And they weren't shooting at us; they were just shooting generally. And we didn't want anyone to get killed, so you had to sleep on the floor. But one of the staff, he literally had a nervous 28-year-old kid. He was a nice kid, but he should never have been in war zone. So we would actually tell people, have you ever heard gunfire? Does it make you nervous? Do you get upset? Have you ever seen a dead body before? Have you ever seen wounds from gunshot? That kind of thing. And if people get freaked out by even hearing it, we tell them to get a job somewhere else in AID that's not in emergencies. So, but you save people, the goal is to save people's lives. It is not to do long-term development where you create sustainable change and build institutions. It's designed to reduce human suffering and save people's lives who are in crisis. Okay? Are all the slides now? This was not one of the slides we put on.
No, those are the last of the two we put on.
All right, next. Okay. What I'm going to go through now is different options for. These are all websites basically because they're mechanisms through which you can look for jobs or for internships. It works both ways. Okay. The first is a website. It's not an organization. And if you just put jobs for development, there's a website that lists hundreds of jobs, mostly funded by USAID contracts or grants. And so that AID partner organizations will simply post job openings, very brief, and then you can apply or not. One second. Foreign Policy Association is another place. I think Mark told me about this. I don't know much about the Foreign Policy, but they apparently have job postings as well. So we put that there just as another option. I think it's broader than just AID. Okay. The premier, I call them a trade association. I think they get offended. I used to be on the board of directors when I was at World Vision, but they are a trade association of NGOs in the United States, American NGOs. Now, Europeans have 2 or 3 similar consortiums of NGOs in Europe that are actually much larger, but not in their budget. This started out $200,000, $300,000. I think it's $20 or $30 million now. It's a very large organization. It's made up of 192 American NGOs, some of them very large, some of them small. And I think almost all of the large NGOs, with the exception of a few faith-based ones, are members of Interaction. Development NGOs and NGOs that do humanitarian work in emergencies. I counted, this was some years ago when I was on the board, and we had about 140, 130 members. About 20% of them are faith-based. And when I say faith-based, Roman Catholic, Protestant, liberal, mainline Protestant, evangelical, Muslim, and there are a few Buddhist NGOs as well. But they're secular and there are religious. So they have a publication called Monthly Development Magazine. What they still called it? They changed the name. I'm on the advisory board. I don't even know they changed the name. It's called Monthly Developments Magazine, and it lists job openings and internships, not just for Interaction, but for the members. Okay? And according to the research we just did, there are about 600 job descriptions and internships on their list now. It used to be that you had to join as an associate member, or I don't know how much money, in order to get into the system. I don't know if that's true anymore. You have to check it yourself. Oh, it is. It says free. Okay, so it is free, so you don't have to pay any money. Used to be that's how they made money. So all of the members post on this on a regular basis, and you can see if there are any openings. Some of them are paid, some of the internships are paid, most of them are not paid. Okay, DebX is a very interesting, it's an online NGO. They don't have any projects in the field, and it started by, I'm trying to remember his name now, but I talked to him on the phone a couple of times, and just go to this website up here, and they do articles. You can join. I mean, it's a membership organization. It's not. They don't do lobbying, that kind of thing. But they're basically an information center for international development professionals. And I actually asked the guy who runs it, how many people, if you include local NGOs, how many people are doing international development work in the world? And he said, our estimate is about 2 million. The estimate I gave you before were international NGOs, the UN, the World Bank, professional jobs but there are lots of local NGOs that are only based in one country and their headquarters are in the third world. They're not Western NGOs. And so, just go back 1 second. So if you go there, the current list of jobs, 1,800. Keep going. Okay. And this is a good example of what one of the pages looks like. This is the country in the middle. How many of you know where Vanuatu is? You're going to fail miserably international development if you don't know where Vanuatu is. It was chosen by the Millennium Challenge Corporation. We had a huge fight over it. For only 50,000 people, it's an island nation. And it fit the mathematical eligibility requirements, and the president insisted we apply them. I said, for 50,000 people on an island somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, no one even knows where it is. Anyway, okay, there is a position. at Vanuatu. And this is the organization that is hosting. Okay? So in black is the name of the contractor NGO. Now let me just sort of make a distinction here between NGOs and contractors. Many of you have heard of NGOs because they're well known. There's so many of them now. And they raise a lot of money. Many of them advertise and are very visible. Okay? There's another part of the business, and it is a business no matter what anyone tells you. The NGOs are nonprofits, but there's not small. World Vision, the NGO I work for, is vice president. By the way, one of the many vice presidents. There was one vice president. Right now, the last time I looked, which was 2 years ago, they were $2.8 billion, and they employ 40,000 people full-time, and they raise 70% of that money privately. It's not government money. Some NGOs are, I would call them parastatals. They get all their money from AID or from DFID, the British aid agency, or CETA, the Canadian aid agency. So they are, in some ways, just extensions of the aid agency that they get funding from. And they get 80 and 90% of their money. But they will call themselves NGOs and pretend they're completely independent. I was being interviewed for the president of an organization that got 80% of its money from aid. And I said, you were an extension, I shouldn't have said it, but I said, you were essentially an extension of American foreign policy, and they got extremely upset. And I said, do you think you're independent of the federal government? You have no independent money. All of it comes from AID. I mean, what would happen if they withdrew the money? And people got angry. Anyway. I suggested they raise some private money, and that's what they didn't know how to do really well. But there are NGOs like World Vision that raise, or Samaritan's Purse. Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, started that. He started $20 million a year. I think they're up to $200 or $300 million now, quite large. And they get almost no government. So there also are profit-making companies. Now the NGOs call them Beltway bandits. They say, oh, they have huge overhead rates. They're making enormous profits and baloney. Well, Oxfam particularly has distorted the data, and I actually got into an argument with several senior people at Oxfam who have, I mean, they basically don't know. I don't think they're doing it maliciously. Well, actually, maybe they are doing it maliciously, but they're misleading people in Washington as to what the profit margin for federal contractors, and I don't know about the Defense Department, but all other than defense, all of the contractors, are regulated as to how much their profit is, 3 to 4%. And when you take out the cost of borrowing money because the federal government doesn't pay when they're supposed to, you have to borrow money to meet cash flow, it's even less than 3%. So, and they claim to have much higher overhead rates, 30% overhead rates. Well, there's some studies done at the University of India Nonprofit Center. And I have to tell you, I've seen the analysis, because the AID contractors will bid against big NGOs like CARE or Save the Children for the same contract. And they have to file, not what they filed for the Wall Street Journal listing of all American charities that say what the overhead rate is. That's not a real overhead rate. I have to just, Money Magazine does it. There's a study that was done at the business school at Stanford. And they actually looked at the real rates versus the rates that are filed, and there's a huge disparity between what they say they're spending for overhead and what they actually spend. And it's not that they're lying, it's that they're flexible terms. Contractors, because they're regulated under a different law, they don't have any flexibility. If they start lying, if they start being flexible, they'll get indicted. So they don't have the flexibility that NGO does in terms of overhead and what's not. Some of the NGOs actually have higher overhead rates than the contractors do. So when you talk to an NGO, they don't work for them. The contractors are all, they make all these profits, all that. My experience is that I've worked for both NGOs and I've been on boards of contractors. There's a lot of comparison between them. So I would urge you, if you don't find an NGO you want to work for, then you might want to work for a contractor. And it's also sometimes difficult to tell who's a contractor and who's an NGO now, because there's a overlap. Some contractors are behaving more like NGOs, and some NGOs are behaving more like contractors. The salary levels of some of the NGOs are astronomically high for their CEOs. That's one way you tell the difference in there. When you have a $600,000 a year salary for a CEO of an NGO, that is not typical. I mean, it means they're behaving more like a contractor. Anyway, so don't limit yourself just to NGOs. And the NGOs that are listed in the Interaction website, by the way, the one I just mentioned, the Trade Association of NGOs, they have a list of all their members, where their headquarters is, the kind of work they do, and what their annual budgets are. So you can go in and find out. Now, AID has its own listing, which we're going to get to in a minute. This last time I looked, which again was 2 years ago, was 550 NGOs. So there are a lot more NGOs on the AID list than there are on the Interaction list. And you can get some idea of size. Okay. The Society for International Development is the one place that both the contractors and the NGOs sort of have a peace agreement not to attack each other too overtly. They work together, and this actually, I don't know if it started in Europe or not, but there are big chapters in Europe and one in the United States, in Washington. They have an annual dinner and 1,000 people go to it. I was invited to go to the Interaction meeting, I think it was a year or two, and I was shocked that there were 1,000 people. We used to get 50 people or 100 people come to the Interaction annual meetings. Now, this one that I went to, there were 1,000 people. So the business of development has grown very, very substantially, both privately funded and publicly funded. The Society for International Development is in some ways like DebX, except it's a membership organization of organizations. DebX is more individual members. And the Society for International Development does also post positions. And I think you can join for a relatively modest amount of money, either DebX or, and if you get on their list, then electronically you can get these newsletters. If you're going to go into international development, you might want to join one or two of these if it's not too expensive, simply to read the articles that appear. It's a profession, and if you want to keep up with the profession, you need to join professional associations. Okay, next. Okay, now I'm a little biased here. This is our logo that we developed when I was administrator 10 years ago. State Department's been trying to rescind it ever since, and some of the domestic agencies get angry at it. But it was our attempt after the 9/11 attack to raise AID's visibility, and everything has to have this on it. We used to have, this goes back to the Marshall Plan, which is the start of the beginning of the handshake. But we didn't have the circle around it, and then we didn't have any of the, we would say, from the American people. The British aid agency criticized us for advertising our work. We're supposed to be doing all this work, and no one's supposed to know about it. And several members of the British Parliament went to the Third World, and they saw everywhere, you would say, from the American people. They went back and said, "Are you idiots? What do you mean you're not going to advertise us?" So after they criticized us, the British have the new logo, red, white, and blue, differed from the British people on all their projects. And the staff at AID was so furious over it, they wanted to sue the British government for copyright infringement. I said, don't do that. Just needle them a little bit at conferences. That's the best way. Settle people. Anyway, there used to be a lot of job postings at AID, but since the budget crisis over the last year, I am told there are not a lot of postings. There are some. I'm not sure. We used to have 2 classes of Foreign Service officers every year. And let me just explain here. There's an act that was passed, I think Senator Sarbanes from Maryland wrote it many years ago, creating the Foreign Service system as we now know it. And people think of the Foreign Service as principally the State Department. But the State Department, I think there are about 5,000 Foreign Service offices. I think there are 1,500 in AID. And they're not the same system. They're under the same law, but the people are chosen differently. At State, you have to take a written exam. AID's never had written exams. At State, you have to have a bachelor's degree. I don't think there's a requirement, although increasing numbers of officers have advanced degrees. In AID, if you don't have a master's degree, a PhD, a law degree, or a medical degree, you can't get in the Foreign Service. Interesting. And this has been the case for 40 years. There are some very senior officers who don't like AID at State, who applied when they were just out of school to go into the aid Foreign Service, and they would tap them on the head to say, Sonny, go back and get a master's degree or PhD, and we'll take you more seriously later. And then they went to State and took the exam, and then they passed, and they risen to the seat, but they remember not getting chosen at aid, and they would used to make these little comments to me about how elitist we were at the State, at the AID. But we don't have an exam. Your exam is your resume, your CV. You go through 2 days of interviews with 2 committees. Okay, this is kind of important. One committee is your technical skills and development. If you have an MPH, then you'll have a group of medical professionals, health professionals at AID, and they will interview you and see whether you know anything about the discipline. What your grades are is important, but you can get nice grades and know nothing about the discipline. I've seen that happen before. And so you'll have your profession in front of you, and they'll just ask you, if you've never heard of Amartya Sen, or you've never heard of Robinson and Asimoglu's new book on development, why some countries develop, why some countries don't, the latest literature, people won't take you seriously. If you don't know who Douglas North is, forget it. You're toast in these interviews. That's one committee. The second committee, which we had abolished in the 90s, and we had a high rate of people who never made tenure. Could you get tenure in the Foreign Service? And I called the personnel people and I said, how come all these people are getting thrown out before they get tenure? He said, we didn't tell you this, Mr. Administrator, but we abolished the second committee. I said, what second committee? Because of the budget cuts in the 90s, we lost 40% of our staff. We abolished the second step. The second step was to see whether you can work well with others. Are you a prima donna? Do you have any management skills in your body at all, somewhere? Because if you are disorganized and you are a poor manager, poor leader, we don't want you. They don't want you in aid. Why? Because you're managing $13, $14 billion. If you want to go to jail, screw up on the management side. I'm not suggesting a lot of people go to jail because those people don't last very long. Okay? The reality is, I said this at my hearing. Senator Biden and Senator Helms chaired my confirmation hearing, and they both asked me whether aid should be made part of the State Department, and I said no. Actually, we're much closer to the Defense Department in terms of skill sets. And Senator Biden, now Vice President Biden, said, Mr. Natsios, I have never heard anyone say that. Could you explain to me what that means? How could you say that? I said, how do you get promoted? How do you get chosen in the State in the Defense Department? How do you get as an officer or a senior NCO? And then how do you make it up to the senior ranks? You have leadership skills and management skills. You're a project manager. You may not think war is a project, but it's a set of projects. Okay? State Department, now, I know people are going to get upset who are for a diplomat. I was a diplomat for a while. I'm not being critical. I think our diplomats are the best in the world. I genuinely do believe that. But they're not chosen and trained and promoted and incented on the same system aid and state DOD. In DOD and AID, if you don't get any training, you don't get promoted. Because these are technical management requirements. If you want to run aid or state, run AID as an officer or run projects or in DOD, you have to know the federal acquisition regulations. Federal acquisition regulations are 2,000 pages long. They tell you how to manage projects under federal law. I don't particularly like them. I think they're damaging to development, but they're there. You have to comply with them. State is doing a little bit more of this, but before, I had State Department career diplomats say, that is a clerical function for low-level people. Diplomats do not do project management. Diplomats make policy, they do negotiating, they analyze the political situation, they're the head of the country team. And they collect information, they analyze information, they make policy based on that. And they will tell the military what they think the military should do or AID should do, whatever. So they're about information and writing, okay? There is a cable, award at State called the Cable Writing of the Year Award, the best cable written. Cables are the way in which Washington is informed about what's really going on in the field. AID used to ridicule the notion that anybody should get an award because they write a good cable. We would say you've managed a good project, and you get awards in AID for being a good project manager, having a successful project. No one gets, at least unless things have changed the last 2 years, no one gets awards for Project Manager of the Year in the State Department. Why? Because it's a different kind of agency. Okay? So, the skill set you need for DoD and state aid are, in fact, very similar. And that is why, culturally, there's a huge clash between state and AID. AID is gradually being absorbed into state, which I think is very destructive, but that's another question. Please. Now, there's a second career track beyond the foreign service in AID. That is the civil service system. Okay, and the civil service entry point is through what's called the President PMF program, the Presidential Management Fellow Program. In that, you do take a test, but it's for the whole federal government. And then you choose the agency you want to work for, and the agency chooses you. You have 6-month iterations. Most of my students at Georgetown who got it through the we would have about 12 to 14 PMFs enter the civil service system in the federal government to aid or state every year. We used to have a lot more, but they changed the exam. It's a different kind of exam. It's not the PMF used to choose the smartest kids. Now it tends to choose people who have good relational skills and good team building skills, because they found a lot of very smart people were prima donnas and were not lasting very long in the system. Because if you're a prima donna, I mean, no one wants to think of themselves as a prima donna. But if you really think you're smarter than everybody else and you don't really need to work with people, again, you need to find another job. Because in this business, you have to be able to work in team-based systems and get along with people and not try to, is it competitive? The foreign service system, all in state and aid, is very competitive. It's much more competitive than the civil service system. Your promotions in the foreign service are based on your performance reviews. That is not the case in the civil service system, which is the great weakness of the civil service system. But it is, if you're in the foreign service, it means you have to go abroad. 3 years plus a year. So a typical foreign service posting will be for 4 years, and you bid on positions. The military officers system in the United States is the same system, personnel system, in terms of the rules that the foreign service system is. I don't think most military and most diplomats don't know this, but from a personnel standpoint, if you look at the way the rules work, when you get into the senior ranks, if you don't get promoted, you're forced to retire once you get into the general officer ranks. That's also the case in the senior foreign service. If you're not promoted after a certain number of years, you're required to retire. It's a very competitive system, and you have to move around, and you bid on positions. You put down first, second, third choice in terms of the countries and the jobs that you want to bid on. This is for the State Department and AID. Okay. This is a description of and there's a senior management system that Jimmy Carter invented or created in the Civil Service Reform Act of 1979 that went through when Carter was president. It created a senior executive service, which is like the senior foreign service. People in AID always want to become high, what do most military officers really want? They want their stars. They want to become a general officer. It means you've made it. Okay? Most people can make it to, I was lieutenant colonel in the reserves. I was in 22 years, not a terribly successful, I at least made it past major. Okay? But people our officers here, the Army fellows, really they're on a fast track unless they screw up to become general officers. And that's why they came. Okay? And you can see the officers and aide who are headed for the senior foreign service. To become a mission director, there are 88, the last time I looked, 80 missions in the field that run programs in countries, that have staff. That is what AID officers want to become. That is what they aspire to. And you have to be in the senior foreign service. Senior foreign service officers are the same rank in terms of the federal system as a general officer is in the Defense Department, or an admiral or a general. Okay? So when you see a mission director, they're almost always 99% of the time they are senior foreign service officers, and they are an equal in rank. I had people volunteer, senior foreign service officers volunteer to be brigade and division advisors in Iraq, because I wanted officers who could speak from a personnel standpoint at the same level. I didn't want 22-year-old kids telling a general what he should or should not be doing in combat operations. So these are the civil service positions. In the civil service, you spend your career at the headquarters in Washington. You go out for particular periods of time, sometimes 2-3 months, sometimes longer than that. But you will not be posted abroad. If you want to spend your life moving around the world and seeing the world, you want to be in the Foreign Service. If you want to live in the United States and then go out for a few months at a time, you want to be a civil servant in AID. Okay, this is, now these I've listed here, all of the disciplines that are now in the personnel system. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of them. Humanitarian response is what I described earlier. That's the career track for emergency aid in famines, wars, and natural disasters. Okay, that's the bottom one there. And conflict mitigation is the same category, and so is democracy and government. Those three bottom ones are a particular personnel category that we created when I was administrator 10 years ago, because foreign service officers were damaged or were penalized in their careers if they went into the emergency response function. And when I created this, I was administrator and they didn't have much choice. I ordered them to do this. It's called Backstop 76. In the State Department, these personnel specializations are called cones. In AID, they're called backstops. You heard the word cone. If Ambassador Napper is mentioning that term, that's a State Department term. We call them backstops. Backstop 76 is the bottom three. Okay? And that is, the most amusing thing is the senior officers who did this over I did this over their objection. They said, Andrew, no one will volunteer to go into this. No one. And that's the problem you're going to have. I said, fine, well, let's just see what happens. So we posted it. 125 senior officers switched their specialty in AID to join this specialty because they liked the work. And that shocked a lot of the old-timers who were resisting my reforms in this area. So we now have a lot of foreign service officers in these bottom three categories. But then as you go up, you see people who are education or public health. Now there are 400 in AID, last time I looked, maybe 500 now, people with master's degrees or PhDs in public health or epidemiologists. There are only 20 or 30 doctors, because the doctrine in international development is to focus on preventative care as opposed to curative care. We prevent people from getting sick because most people die in the third world from communicable disease, which is preventable. How do most people die in the United States?
Heart disease.
Heart disease or cancer. Okay? Now, you can prevent those by your diet and exercise and all, but they're not communicable diseases that you get an immunization. Anyway, so the focus, you have to understand development theory, which is and they'll make these mean more, okay? Now, I mention this because people look at these words and then they say, well, we do health in the United States. HHS does health. I could work at HHS and then move into AID. And I had a secretary of HHS who said, I'm taking over your whole health portfolio and I'm going to move it over to HHS. He actually, Secretary Powell, this is being recorded. I have to be careful what I say. Paul Powell, who I work for, said, I don't think he actually said that. I said, yes, he did. So we had a lunch. The secretary had a lunch with this particular secretary and me and Powell, the three of us. And in the lunch, he said, I intend to transfer the health function out of aid into HHS. But the problem is that HHS is oriented toward health in the United States, which faces profoundly different problems. Profoundly different problems. Because we're an advanced society in terms of our healthcare system and our hospitals and all that. Anyway, so there's economic growth and trade. Obviously, that's dominated by economists. You can see these here. There are also environment officers, energy officers, and we created a new office because we had abolished it in the 90s of infrastructure. We didn't used to do infrastructure, now we do it. And then Raj Shah, my successor is aid administrator under President Obama, has created a new bureau on food security because President Obama's signature initiative has been in food and agriculture. Next. So anyway, you can go into the AID system and go online and look at how you apply to go into the Presidential Management Fellows Program, take the exams, then you go through an interview process, or you apply for the civil service system. There are also other positions in aid, and I focus on this because the two positions I just described, the civil service personnel route and the foreign service route, take a very long time, as they do in state. They take a year to a year and a half. The federal government, in my view, is becoming increasingly paralyzed by overregulation. In terms of the bureaucracy, it is really, if the federal government were running the whole country, we would be in very big trouble. I don't mean just because of the budget crisis. This has been going on for 20 years now. It's getting worse every year. That's why it takes forever for presidents to put their cabinets in place and sub-cabinet positions. And I think it's out of control, so that's a different question. So what aid does now is they have a different route. They actually have 17 personnel systems. It took me 4 years, because the career people were afraid I was going to start abolishing these other systems. And I found out the reason they have these 17 systems is because the other systems are so dysfunctional in some ways, because it takes so long to hire them. If we're having a major crisis or big, massive increase in spending in Iraq for Iraq reconstruction, I can't wait a year and a half to hire officers. You have to find some other way to do it. This is one of the major ways. I asked one of the most senior career officers, who I have great respect for. He's an intellectual and a very honest guy. He works for an aid contractor now because he's retired. I said, Gordon, who are the smartest people up in the 17 systems? Who are the best managers, the best development professionals? He said, well, Andrew, I'm a foreign service officer, so I shouldn't be saying foreign service. It's actually the PSCs. He said there are about 300 or 400 PSCs, personal service contractors. Now, personal service contractors are different than contractors. There's subtle distinctions. If you're a PSC for AID, you are contracted with AID to work directly for AID. You don't work for a company. Okay? And you usually get a 3 or 4 year contract, and you are treated as though you are a commodity. In other words, it's not the personnel office that chooses you. It's the acquisitions office, the contracting office of AID. And you submit your CV, and frequently there's always a job description. You don't get any health benefits or insurance, but they give you an extra stipend, and 10% plus up on your salary to do that. Okay? Now, and most importantly, you do not get a diplomatic passport, which is in a war zone of some. It's actually not just in a war zone. It's always useful in the developing world to have a diplomatic passport. Believe me. I wish I had one now. So, now, I had someone who worked for me for many years, and I moved her career up, and she's one of the most brilliant officers in aid. And no one knew she was a PSC. She's worked for AID for 24 years now. And she's a personal service. I said, why don't you join the Foreign Service? She said, I don't want to be in the Foreign Service. That means I have to move to different countries every 4 years. She spent most of the 24 years in 5 countries. And she's very well known, and most American diplomats, in fact, many career people in aid think she's a Foreign Service officer. Okay? So, her PSC positions are being advertised now at aid. I am told if you look at the Foreign Service or the Civil Service, you get you click on an AID, they put you into GSA or some other federal agency where they're trying to centralize, which is, I mean, these are the management technocrats in charge again, screwing everything all up, thinking they're making things more efficient than the federal government. Actually, they're screwing things up. In my view, by doing this, it's irrelevant. That's what happens. They don't do the PSC through these central mechanisms. I don't even think, frankly, the personnel office in the federal understands this system. AID actually hides a lot of the subtleties of these systems to avoid outsiders coming and mucking up the systems, because these are all coping mechanisms that aid managers use to make the place functional. I would strongly suggest you consider looking through this, and I guess PSC opportunities are, it says Fed Biz Ops. I guess some of them do go through there. But I know I've seen some on the website. In the emergency area, a lot of PSCs are hiding. So look both places. Go ahead. Okay, now, earlier I talked about NGOs and contractors as partner organizations. Okay? Now there is, again, you may say, I want to work for the federal government. Well, that's fine, but you're going to have to wait a year and a half. The sequester will affect it, because the budget fights that are going on now affect you. If you work for World Vision, or you work for CARE, or Save the Children, or Comonix, which is a contractor, you are less affected. Now, you're still affected, but I want to show you now the 25 top. This is, I think, for last fiscal year. I think it was for fiscal, could have been fiscal 12, for 2012. These are the largest now. I can go through the list as to who is who. Comonix is a for-profit. Okay? DAI is a for-profit. I believe John Snow is a non-profit. It's a non-profit, but it's really not an NGO per se. Berger, Black and Beach is a contractor. So these are the top AID contractors and NGOs. Okay? And what I would suggest is, if you're interested, go on their websites and see whether they have job postings, working on aid contracts or aid grants. And they'll tell you whether, you can tell whether they're a contractor or an NGO by, they'll say. Excuse me. Next. Okay, these are, now, NGOs get grants, but they also now bid on contracts. Some contractors will bid on grants, but very few, because you can't make a profit on a grant. A grant is designed for nonprofits. These are the top AID NGOs in terms of funding. I'm not going to go through each one of them. I know this. I know the CEOs of some of these. These also include the governments, because one of Raj Shah's initiatives is to move away from AID partner organizations to the old AID system, which we used from the 1940s, even before AID existed as it is now, by name. From the 40s until the early 80s, our money principally went through indigenous governments. So if we were to do a project in Brazil, we went through the Brazilian government. And you have to take my course on international development theory and practice to know why we moved away from that system and what the weaknesses and strengths are. But the Raj Shah is attempting to move 30%, this is causing huge controversies in Washington, of the budget of AID through local indigenous organizations or governments. So that's why you see the Jordanian government listed up there and the Pakistani government listed at the bottom. That's how much money is going through their governments. They're the two largest. Next. Okay. The United Nations and the World Bank, the whole constellation of institutions that were created at the end of World War II, they're called the Bretton Woods institutions. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the other international development banks, and then UN and UN agencies, were run by Americans for decades. I personally believe Americans make the best managers internationally, and better even than the Europeans. And I have many European friends. They'd be offended by me saying this, but that's my opinion. Okay, why? I think, frankly, because we're in a multicultural society, we have sensitivity in our society toward people from different religious traditions and racial traditions and ethnic groups. We come from some language that their ancestors spoke. So there is a sensitivity in our culture to how you deal with complex situations. Two, we tend to be a very practical people, and if things don't work, we abandon them. If they work, we're not into ideology. And I mean, liberals and conservatives, when they get to the third world, if something is not working, but ideologically everybody keeps saying we got to keep doing this, the Americans are the first ones to say, what is the matter with you people? This is not working, we're dumping this, we're going to do something that works. The Europeans tend to be a little bit more, we have to endorse this because, the UN has endorsed this. And UN workers themselves are saying, but it doesn't work, so why do we keep doing this? Now, it's changed, however. The UN now is, principally to people from the developing world. So there is a bias. It's not written in the rules against hiring Americans at the World Bank or the UN. However, if you look at the management structure, a lot of these places, they have Americans in them. And for example, he just retired, but Kevin Kennedy was a bird colonel in the Marine Corps in Somalia. And he called me after Somalia. This is a Somalia intervention of President Bush 41 in 1992. Kevin was the chief of staff of the Marine Corps when we intervened. The Joint Task Force had intervened. And I worked with him. And when he retired after 30 years in the Marines, he said, I want to go work for the UN. I said, well, they need you. And he went to work and he rose very rapidly. Whenever things were screwed up, they sent Kevin Kennedy in to fix them, and he always fixed the stuff in the field. Okay, he had a very distinguished career, over 20 years in the UN. He just retired from the UN. Why am I telling you this? Because while they don't hire Americans, they do hire Americans. So there's a bias against it. Next slide. But nevertheless, people do get in. Who gets in? Well, one, there are different tracks in UN agencies. There is the UN Secretariat, which is in that building that looks like a giant cookie, a wafer in Boston, New York City. That's the UN Secretariat. Okay. Then there are 62, the last time I counted, 62 specialized UN agencies that are relatively autonomous. They're relatively autonomous from the headquarters. They have a separate budget, separate personnel system. Now, are they part of the UN? Yes. Are they UN employees? Yes. We are going to speak, and I've heard all of you should go hear her, okay? Catherine Bertini is speaking Thursday, okay? She was the director for 2 terms. I think she's the only one in recent history served 2 terms, 10 years, as the director of the World Food Program. She was Undersecretary of Agriculture. She served in the first Bush administration 25 years ago. And Catherine was the transformational figure in the creation of the modern World Food Program. The World Food Program is the largest UN agency, and I would argue the best managed and most effective UN agency. And she is one of the 10 most revered humanitarian figures in the world. She received the World Food Prize, which is sort of like, in our business, like the Nobel Prize for Peace. She got the equivalent of that. And I don't know if anybody else actually gets that prize in a position that she had. And she is a role model for women, I might add, in development. She's a professor at the Maxwell School. I asked her to come. We only have a few Bush people. Everybody from agriculture school is going to hear her because they know who she is. If you're interested in a development career, and she's going to talk about some of the things she did when she was Undersecretary of Agriculture 25 years ago, but then she will talk about what she did at WFP. She transformed the World Food Program from a Cold War institution that was small, kind of dysfunctional, into this powerhouse that it is now. Okay, and it quadrupled in size, and she fired a lot of people and put new people in. Instead of going through governments in the third world, she now goes through NGOs, and Catherine will talk about that. So, you can go through, up on the postings, career positions. They have career track positions where you're in the UN for a long time. That's where it's hard to get jobs in America. Okay? However, they have other jobs, sort of like PSCs, where you get a contract for 3 years, you work for an agency. If you have a particular skill set, you can get those jobs. I have a lot of my students in those positions. Okay, are there questions? No, oh, that's right, we're almost out of time, right? What do we have? 4 minutes, we have 4 minutes. There are no questions at all. Everybody said questions, so no one's going to come to see me, is that correct? Yes.
Question. What would you suggest would be the best way to prepare for the Presidential Management Fellows exam?
I haven't taken the exam, so I don't actually know what's in it. Okay, but for any of these jobs, obviously, you want to take the international development economic. What's the? We changed the name of it now. The concentration. Yeah. Say it again.
International development and economic policy.
Right. My suggestion is you concentrate on that. If you made a decision you want to do this as a career, that's what you want to do. 2, some of the courses that Khaldun teaches, Khaldun Abouassi teaches, even though I think he's on the SA side. He teaches a course in international NGOs. Now, even if you don't want to work for an NGO, you need to understand how NGOs work because they're such a dominant force. I mean, most governments, particularly in Africa, they hate the NGOs. They do, because they've taken over their function. Right? But you need to know what they're all about. 2, he teaches a course in grant management. I hope that a course will be taught in contract management using the Federal Acquisition Regulations. I don't think he focuses on the FAR, it's called Federal Acquisition Regulations. But I think there may be some efforts being made to do a course in contract management. There's going to be a course, I think next year offered, I believe, on evaluation. Is that right?
Field research with Professor Gottlieb.
But it's not being taught now.
No, no.
Okay, it's important. That's a new focus, not a new focus. It's a renewed focus. We did heavy focus for the first 40 years of aid, and then it was abolished in the 90s because of budget constraints, and we tried to revive it over the last 10 years, and we've had some success at it. But it's a big focus for the Gates Foundation, for example, and NGOs even that use private money. So you need to focus on that as well. I would suggest all of you read The Economist cover to cover, subscribe to it, or get it online, or go to the library and read it from now until the time you graduate. Read the whole thing. Now, I don't always agree with The Economist, but in terms of magazines that have people on the ground that know what's going on, The Economist is more often right. They make mistakes, they do stupid things sometimes, but for the most part, they're on target in terms of knowing what's going on, and they're so broad. I would suggest one way of preparing yourselves on the substance of the world, because the AID is a development agency in the World Bank's a development agency, and so is the UN. However, if you're in Syria doing humanitarian, you have to know who the Alawites are. It's not in any textbook on humanitarian relief who the Alawites are. They've been running Syria for 40 years, brutally I might add. But you have to know who they are. You have to know who the 11 militias are in Syria, or you get yourself kidnapped and killed. Okay? So it's kind of important that you master the larger economic, political, diplomatic, and military context of the world in addition to the work, and not just be isolated in our field. I might also add, being able to speak clearly and write clearly is very important. And some of you are smart, but you don't have writing skills, I have to say. I had students at Georgetown who were brilliant, and they could not write well. And it hurt their careers in AID and in the World Bank and other places. So writing skills, and if you're going to the State Department, you're gone if you can't write. That is one of the most important skills, is good writing. Does that answer your question? Other questions? We have one more question. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's dropped. Yeah, definitely.
I saw you raised the line.